He bought a failed bank for 15 cents, then found an Outlaws' $44 million stash inside. Charles Brennan stared at the deed, the ink still tacky in the dry air. 15 cents. That's what it cost him. The entire 3-story Millfield bank building, his for less than a stick of licorice. The seller, a man whose hands wouldn't stop shaking, had practically thrown the papers at him. He just wanted to be rid of the place. But you have to wonder, why would any man sell a brick building for pocket change? Across the dusty street, the townsfolk watched him. Their faces were like stone masks, and their eyes held something that wasn't curiosity, and it sure wasn't welcome. It was something else. Something that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Old Mrs. Henderson, from the general store. She'd look at the boarded-up windows of the bank, then snap her head away like she'd seen a ghost. Like the building itself was a sin she didn't want to be caught looking at. The seller, that nervous fella, he'd given only one condition before he spurred his horse and vanished from town. "Whatever you find in there," he'd said, his voice a dry rattle. "It ain't my problem anymore." He was gone before Charles could even ask what he meant by that. Now, standing there, Charles saw the first lie. Everyone said the bank burned down. A total loss. But there were no scorch marks on the brick. No sign of a fire at all. The windows behind the boards were dusty but whole. So why the lie? What really happened in that building? He pulled the old iron key from his pocket. The same key the seller had pressed into his palm, his skin cold and damp. As Charles walked toward the heavy oak doors, he could have sworn he heard something. Not a noise, really. More like the memory of a noise, an echo trapped in the wood. He was about to learn that what was behind that door would make 15 cents the most expensive purchase of his entire life. The door groaned open on rusty hinges, letting out a breath of air that tasted like old paper and buried secrets. Charles stepped inside, his boot heels clicking on the marble floor. It was a tomb. Slanted beams of light cut through the boarded windows, and dust motes danced in the air like tiny, restless spirits. The place felt wrong. Not ruined, like they said. But empty. Too empty. Too clean. The teller's counter was still polished to a high shine. The brass fixtures on the doors gleamed softly in the dim light. It was like someone had been taking care of the place. He ran a hand over the smooth, cool wood of the counter. How could a burned-out building look this preserved? It didn't make a lick of sense. And that's when he saw it. Behind the counter, a patch of wall was just a little bit different. The paint was fresher, newer. He pressed his hand against it, feeling the smooth surface. "This was painted recently," he whispered, the sound swallowed by the big, empty room. Who would bother to paint a wall inside a building that was supposed to be a ruin? His eyes drifted down to the floor. Papers, not scattered like they'd been dropped in a panic. They were laid out, placed. He knelt and gathered them up, his fingers tracing the faded ink. They were bank records, all from the same week, years ago. And they were all signed by a man named Chester Draper. The numbers on those pages made his heart start to pound. Thousands and thousands of dollars, moving in and out of this tiny town's bank in just a few days. It was more money than a place like Millfield should see in a decade. "Looking for something specific?" The voice came out of nowhere. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Charles jumped to his feet, spinning around. A woman stood in the doorway, a dark shape against the blinding sun outside. She wore a plain dress, but she held herself like she owned the ground she stood on. "I own this place now," Charles said, his voice a little shaky. "Bought it, fair and square." The woman stepped inside, letting the heavy door swing shut behind her, plunging the room back into near darkness. "For 15 cents, I heard." Her voice wasn't judging him. It was just curious. "I'm Clara Malaloy. I used to work here." Charles looked at her, really looked at her, trying to read the answers to questions he didn't even know he had yet. Everyone told me it burned down, he said. But there's no fire damage. Clara's face hardened in the gloom. That's because the fire wasn't the kind that leaves scorch marks. She took a step closer, and her voice dropped so low he had to lean in to hear it. Some fires burn from the inside out, Mr. Brennan. They burn up trust. They burn down reputations. They turn a good, honest place into something else. What are you trying to say? He asked, his gut twisting into a knot. I'm saying you didn't buy a failed bank. Clara's eyes flicked over to that freshly painted patch of wall behind the counter. You bought something much, much more dangerous. Charles felt a cold dread creep up his spine. The papers in his hand suddenly felt like they weighed 100 pounds. His 15-cent gamble was about to get real expensive, and not in a way money could fix. But before he could get another word out, Clara was already walking toward that wall. Her fingers were tracing the paint, like she knew it by heart, like she knew exactly what was hiding just beneath the surface. Clara's fingers found a spot on the wall and pressed. Charles heard a faint click, then the quiet sound of wood sliding on wood. A 3-foot section of the wall swung inward, opening into pitch-black darkness. That's impossible, Charles whispered, the papers slipping from his hand and scattering on the floor. I looked this place over top to bottom before I bought it. Did you? Clara's voice was sharp, her eyes locking onto his in the dim light. Or did you just see what someone wanted you to see? From the hidden passage, a strange smell drifted out. It was a cold, metallic smell, like a pile of old coins. Charles grabbed an oil lamp from behind the counter, struck a match, and the little flame chased the shadows away from Clara's face. You knew this was here, he said, and it wasn't a question. I knew Chester Draper, she answered, stepping into the passage without a moment's hesitation. I knew the kind of man who would sell a place like this for 15 cents. Charles followed her, the lamplight throwing their long, dancing shadows against rough-hewn wooden walls. The tunnel seemed to go down, deeper than the bank's foundation should have gone. So Draper cheated me? He asked. Chester Draper cheated everyone. Her voice echoed back to him from the darkness ahead. The real question, Mr. Brennan, is if you're brave enough to find out what you really bought. The narrow passage opened up into a room that shouldn't exist. Charles lifted the lamp, and his jaw went slack. Stacked from the dirt floor to the low ceiling were wooden crates. Hundreds of them. Each one was stenciled with numbers and strange symbols he didn't recognize. The metallic smell was so strong in here it was almost sickening. Clara walked to the nearest crate and pried the lid open with her bare hands. Charles leaned over, holding the lamp high. Inside were bundles of cash. More money than he had ever seen, more than he had ever imagined. His hand started to shake, making the lamplight flicker wildly. He raised it higher, and the light revealed that every single crate in the room was the same, just packed to the brim with money. How much is in here? He whispered, his voice hoarse. Chester used to brag it was more than most men see in 10 lifetimes. Clara's voice was flat, cold as the dirt floor. $44 million, hidden where no one would ever think to look. Charles set the lamp down on a crate, his knees feeling weak. This can't be legal, he managed to say. Banks don't hide cash like this. You're right, it's not legal, Clara said, turning to face him. Her eyes were hard. Every single dollar in this room was stolen from families all across 3 territories. Chester Draper wasn't just a banker, Mr. Brennan. He was a thief. He was the man who showed every outlaw and criminal in the West how to wash their dirty money and hide their stolen fortunes. The truth hit Charles like a physical blow. The strange looks from the townsfolk, the seller's nervous hands, the warning. Whatever you find in there, it ain't my problem anymore. They all knew. They all knew this wasn't just a bank. If this money is stolen, Charles started, his mind reeling. Then keeping it makes you a criminal, Clara finished for him. Unless you do the one thing Chester Draper never had the guts to do. Charles looked around the secret room. $44 million. It was enough money to fix every mistake he'd ever made. Enough to start over 1,000 times. But as he stared at the stacks of stolen cash, a new, terrifying thought pushed its way into his mind. If Clara knew about this room, who else did? And what would they do to the man who just found it? Charles stared at Clara, the lamplight carving deep shadows on her face. $44 million, he repeated, the number feeling alien in his mouth. And you're saying I should just... What? Give it back? I'm saying, Clara said, her voice sharp as broken glass, that you have a choice. A choice Chester Draper stole from every single person he robbed. She lifted the lid from another crate, revealing stack after stack of neatly bundled bills. These families, they lost everything. Their farms, their savings, the money they'd put away for their children. But how? Charles asked, his head spinning. How would I ever find them? This money could be from anywhere. Anyone. It was an impossible task. A fool's errand. He couldn't just ride across 3 territories handing out cash. Clara didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into a pocket hidden in the folds of her dress and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound book. A journal. She held it out to him. Chester was meticulous, she said as he took it. The leather was smooth and cool beneath his trembling fingers. And he was paranoid. He kept a record of everything. Names, dates, amounts. He was terrified he'd forget which crime paid for which luxury. Charles opened the journal. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with tight, precise handwriting. It was a ledger of ruin. Each entry was a story of someone's life being destroyed. A robbery, the amount stolen, and the percentage Chester took for himself for hiding the loot. His stomach churned as he read the notes scribbled in the margins. Widow Henderson's inheritance, $2,470. Miller family farm sale, $1,230. Thompson's cattle drive profits, $8,800. These aren't just entries in a book, Charles whispered in horror. These are people, real people. Chester called it business, Clara said, her voice laced with old anger. But it's not just business when you're reading about the money a family lost that was meant for their kids' medicine, or the savings they were going to use to survive the winter. Charles kept turning the pages, each one a fresh wave of despair. The sheer scale of the theft was staggering. Then he stopped. One name kept appearing, over and over again. But it wasn't listed as a victim. It was written in the notes, a recurring detail in the story of Chester's crimes. The name was Clara Malloy. He looked up from the journal, his eyes meeting hers. You knew, he said, the realization dawning on him. You knew what he was doing all along. You tried to stop him. I tried to warn people, she admitted, her hands clenching into tight fists at her sides. I sent anonymous letters to families I knew he was targeting. But Chester found out. Her expression darkened. He couldn't afford to have me talking. He threatened my family. In a town this small, a ruined reputation is a death sentence. So you stayed quiet. It was an accusation. I stayed alive, she shot back, her eyes flashing with a pain that was still fresh. But I never stopped watching. I never stopped writing. Every meeting he took, every deal he made, every stolen dollar that passed through this bank. I wrote it down. I knew, someday, there would have to be a reckoning. Charles closed the journal. The little book felt heavier than all the gold in the world. Why tell me this now? Why not just go to the law yourself? Because Chester Draper isn't done with this money, Clara said. And she suddenly moved toward the entrance of the passage, her head cocked as if she was listening for something. He sold you this building for a reason. He knew whoever bought it would be curious. He knew they'd find this room. He was just waiting for someone else to take the risk of digging it up. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "Draper didn't just ride off into the sunset after the bank failed. He's been close, watching this place, waiting for his chance to come back and get his fortune." Clara's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "And now that you've found it for him, he'll be coming to get it." A chill, entirely separate from the cold air in the tunnel, snaked its way up Charles's spine. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been watching too," she said, her eyes wide and deadly serious. "And 3 days ago I saw him. Chester Draper rode back into Millfield." The single flame of the oil lamp wavered, throwing their shadows into a frantic dance against the walls of stolen money. In that moment, Charles finally understood. His 15-cent purchase hadn't bought him a building, or even a hidden fortune. It had bought him a starring role in the final act of Chester Draper's story. It had bought him a war with a desperate man. And just as that horrifying thought solidified in his mind, they both heard it. A sound from the main bank floor above them that made them freeze in place. The distinct, unmistakable sound of footsteps. The footsteps weren't random. They moved with a slow, deliberate weight. This wasn't some kid who'd found a way inside. This was someone with a purpose. Charles instinctively reached for the oil lamp to snuff out the light, but Clara's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. Her fingers were like ice. "Don't," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "The light. They'll see it through the floorboards." They stood there in the suffocating darkness of the hidden room, every muscle tensed, listening. The footsteps moved from the front door, across the marble floor, stopping right where the teller's counter was. Right above the hidden entrance. Charles could hear the soft rustle of paper. The person upstairs was going through the same documents he'd found just minutes before. "Chester," Charles mouthed in the dark. Clara shook her head, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his own. "Too light," she mouthed back. She leaned in, so close her lips brushed his ear. "Chester walks like a man who owns the ground he stands on," she whispered, her breath ghosting against his skin. "This is someone else, someone who is searching for something." The footsteps stopped, directly above them. Charles held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. It felt like the person standing on the floorboards above could feel the weight of the $44 million beneath them, could hear the frantic beating of their hearts. Then, a new sound. A sound that turned his blood to ice. The heavy scrape of wooden furniture being dragged across the floor. "They're looking for the entrance," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Charles's mind raced. They were in a dead-end room with a mountain of stolen money. There was only one way out, back through the passage to the fake wall behind the counter. If whoever was up there found that hidden door, they were trapped. Dead. The scraping stopped. Silence descended again, thick and heavy. Then came 3 slow, distinct knocks on the floor directly above their heads. Clara's face, even in the deep shadows, went completely pale. "That's a signal," she choked out. "Someone else is on their way." "A signal for what?" he hissed. "Chester never worked alone," she explained, her words coming in a frantic rush. "He had partners, men who helped him move the cash, helped him silence witnesses. If they find us down here, with this money, they'll assume we're rivals. They won't ask questions. They'll just kill us both to protect their secret." Charles looked around the dark room, the invisible weight of the money pressing in on him. He finally understood the true price of his purchase. He hadn't just bought a building. He'd bought a partnership in a criminal conspiracy, whether he wanted it or not. "There has to be another way out of here," he whispered, a desperate plea. "There is," Clara said, her hands already moving along the far wall, feeling for something in the darkness. "Chester always built himself a back door, an escape route. But if we use it, we have to leave all of this behind." "And if we stay?" he asked. "If we stay, we pray they don't find this entrance." Her hand stopped. He heard another soft click. "And if they do find it," she said, her voice grim, "we pray they're in a merciful mood." The knocking pattern from above repeated, louder this time. It was followed by the groan of the bank's main door opening again. Heavy boots stomped on the marble floor. And then a voice boomed through the building, a voice that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards beneath their feet. "I know you're in here, Clara." The voice was deep and gravelly, full of a chilling confidence. "And I know you brought a friend this time." It was Chester Draper. He had come back for his money, but as Charles clutched the leather journal, he realized that the $44 million might not be the most valuable thing in this room. The truth was. And he had a terrible feeling he was about to have to decide if that truth was worth dying for. If you're finding this story of buried secrets and high-stakes greed as gripping as I do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel, and it lets me know you want more tales from the dark corners of the frontier. Now, let's get back to it. Clara pushed on the hidden panel, and a section of the back wall swung inward, revealing a tunnel even narrower and darker than the one they'd come through. But before they could make a move, Chester's voice thundered from above. "I can hear you down there, whispering like rats in a wall. 40 years in this business teaches a man to recognize the sound of a guilty conscience." Sweat trickled down Charles's temple. Clara frantically motioned for him to follow her into the escape tunnel, but he couldn't move. He was frozen. To run felt like an admission of guilt, but to staying meant facing that monster upstairs. "You know what I find interesting, Clara?" Chester's boots paced back and forth, directly over their heads. Each step was like a drumbeat counting down their final seconds. "This magnificent building, the heart of my entire operation, sold for a paltry 15 cents. 15 cents. A property that once laundered the wealth of 3 territories." "He's trying to bait us," Clara whispered urgently. "He wants us to panic, to give ourselves away. Don't listen to him." But Charles was listening. Every word Chester spoke was a piece of the puzzle, and he needed to understand the whole picture. He needed to know exactly what kind of game he had stumbled into. "And the buyer's name," Chester continued, his voice booming, "is Charles Brennan, a failed merchant from the East, looking to make a fresh start out west. The perfect kind of man, wouldn't you say? The perfect target for someone who needs shall we say, a fall guy?" Charles's blood ran cold. He looked at Clara, the horrific realization dawning on both of them at the same time. "He planned it," Charles breathed. "The sale, the price, it was all a setup." "Of course it was." Chester's voice seemed to be coming from everywhere at once now, echoing in the confined space. "You think I'd just walk away from $44 million? Leave it here for any fool to find? No. I needed someone to find it for me. Someone honest, someone with a conscience, someone who might feel obligated to return all that stolen property to its poor, unfortunate, rightful owners." Clara grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "He's playing with your head, Charles. That's what he does. He twists everything to serve his own ends." "But what if he's right?" Charles whispered back, his eyes going to the leather journal he still clutched in his hand. "What if the only way out of this was to do exactly what the devil wanted?" "Charles Brennan." Chester's voice suddenly cracked like a whip, sharp and direct. "I know you're down there, and I know my dear former employee is with you. I know you found what I so carefully left behind for you to find. The only question that remains is whether you're smart enough to understand why I arranged this little reunion." Ignoring Clara's frantic silent protests, Charles started moving. He moved back toward the entrance to the main passage. "I want to hear what he has to say." "Don't be a fool!" Clara hissed, grabbing for him in the dark. "Chester Draper doesn't arrange meetings. He arranges funerals." But Charles had made up his mind. He needed to face this man. He climbed back up the short passage and pushed open the hidden panel, stepping out from behind the teller's counter. And there he was. Chester Draper. He was smaller than his voice suggested, an older man, impeccably dressed in a fine suit. But his eyes were like chips of cold, gray stone. They missed nothing. Two big men stood on either side of him, their jackets pulled back to show the pearl-handled pistols holstered at their hips. "Mr. Brennan," Chester said, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. The smile didn't come anywhere near his eyes. "A pleasure to finally meet you. Welcome to the most expensive real estate transaction of your life." "You set me up," Charles said, his voice steady despite the frantic pounding in his chest. He held up the journal. "I gave you an opportunity," Chester corrected him smoothly. His cold eyes shifted to the open panel behind Charles. "The very same opportunity I'm about to extend to Miss Malloy, if she's intelligent enough to join our little conversation." He heard Clara's reluctant footsteps behind him. When she emerged from the passage, Chester's smile widened. "Ah, perfect. The whole team is here. Now, we can discuss the terms of your new employment." "Employment?" Charles felt the walls of the trap closing in around him. "You didn't honestly think I'd let $44 million sit down there unguarded forever, did you?" Chester's voice lost its pleasant tone and turned hard. Dangerous. "Congratulations, Mr. Brennan. You are now the official curator and guardian of the largest private criminal fortune in the entire Western Territory." And in that single chilling moment, Charles realized the terrible truth. His 15-cent purchase hadn't just bought him a building. It had made him Chester Draper's newest and most unwilling partner in crime. Chester's cold smile vanished as he watched the horror dawn on Charles's face. "You seem troubled, Mr. Brennan. Perhaps you require some clarification regarding your new duties." "I won't help you," Charles said, his knuckles white as he gripped the journal. "I won't help you steal from innocent people." "Steal?" Chester let out a dry, humorless laugh. It sounded like rocks grinding together. "My dear boy, the stealing is ancient history. That part of the business concluded years ago. What we are discussing now is merely asset management, logistics, protection services for capital that has already been successfully reallocated." "Reallocated from families who needed it," Clara spat, stepping forward. "Families who lost their homes, their land, everything, because of your bottomless greed. Families who were tragically careless with their financial security," Chester corrected her without missing a beat. "But since you've brought them up, perhaps Mr. Brennan here would be interested in an update on the current status of some of our former clients." Charles felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean?" Chester gave a slight nod to one of his large companions. The man reached into his coat and produced a thick sheaf of papers. "These are recent reports," Chester explained calmly. "Gathered by my associates across the territories. For example, would you like to hear what became of the Henderson family after their inheritance was redistributed?" "Stop it," Clara whispered, her voice shaking with rage. But Chester ignored her, his eyes fixed on Charles. "Mrs. Henderson, a widow with 3 young children, now works 16-hour days at the town laundry. The Miller family, whose farm you now technically own the deed to, lost their land and currently reside in a 1-room sod cabin just outside of town. The Williamson children, I'm told, have not had a proper pair of shoes for 2 winters." Charles's hands shook as he fumbled the journal open. He found the names: Henderson, Miller, Williamson. Every name Chester mentioned was there, documented in Clara's neat script, a record of their ruin. Every story was real, every stolen dollar accounted for. "They're still here," Charles said, the weight of it all crushing him. "All of them. They're still alive." "Oh, very much alive," Chester confirmed with a chilling satisfaction. "And very much in desperate need of the money that is currently sitting in your basement, Mr. Brennan. Which brings us back to your new employment. The question is, Do you have the courage to help them get it back? Charles looked at Clara, his eyes pleading for an answer, for a way out. But he saw the same conflict on her face. You knew this, he said to her. You knew they were still suffering. I've been keeping track of them for years, Clara admitted, her voice thick with guilt. Sending what little I could spare. But it was never enough to truly make a difference. That money downstairs, it could give them their lives back. Precisely, Chester said, his voice once again taking on the tone of a reasonable man of business. Which brings us to the practical matter of distribution. $44 million is a cumbersome amount, Mr. Brennan. It cannot simply be moved in a wheelbarrow. It requires careful planning, discreet transportation routes, trusted intermediaries to handle the exchanges. You want me to help you return stolen money to its rightful owners? Charles asked, struggling to wrap his mind around the twisted logic. But under your control. I want you to complete a business transaction that was unfortunately interrupted years ago, Chester said, the mask of civility beginning to crack. Those families deserve their restitution. But, and this is a critical point, if anyone in a position of authority discovers where that money came from, or how it was so miraculously recovered, we will all hang for it. You, me, and our dear Miss Malloy here. The trap was perfect. It was brilliant in its cruelty. Doing the right thing, returning the money, would make him a criminal. It would make him complicit in everything Chester had ever done. And what happens if I refuse? Charles asked, his voice barely a whisper. Chester's expression turned to ice. Then you, Mr. Brennan, will be the man responsible for keeping $44 million from the desperate families who need it to survive. Their continued hunger, their poverty, their suffering. That will be entirely on your conscience. Your choice. Clara stepped closer to Charles. Don't listen to him. He's twisting you in knots. There has to be another way. Is there? Chester asked softly, turning his gaze on Charles. Because I can show you letters, Mr. Brennan. Letters I've intercepted. Letters from these very families, begging for a miracle. Describing their children's empty stomachs. Praying for a savior. Charles looked down at the journal, at the names of the ruined families. Then he looked toward the counter, toward the hidden passage that led down to a fortune that could save them all. He had thought finding the money was the hard part. He was wrong. The hard part was choosing what to do with it. Because it felt like no matter what he chose, he would lose a part of his soul. Charles held Chester's cold gaze, the journal in his hand feeling less like a book and more like a weapon. You're right about one thing, Draper, he said, his voice ringing with a newfound clarity. Those families deserve to have their money back. But they deserve something more. They deserve the truth. The truth, Chester scoffed, is a luxury that desperate people cannot afford, Mr. Brennan. Food is a necessity. The truth is a dessert. No, Charles shot back. The truth is the only thing that will ever set them free from you. He flipped the journal open to a specific section near the back, a section he'd only glanced at before. Clara, he said, not taking his eyes off Chester. You wrote down everything he did, every dollar he stole. But did you also write down who helped him? A flicker of understanding lit up Clara's eyes. The territorial marshal, she said, her voice growing stronger. The circuit judge. The bank inspectors from the capital who came through twice a year and signed off on his fraudulent books. Chester's smug expression finally faltered. For the first time, a hint of fear appeared in his cold eyes. Those are dangerous, unsubstantiated accusations, Mr. Brennan. They're not accusations, Charles said, holding the journal up like a shield. They're evidence. Every bribe you paid. Every official who took your money to look the other way. Every single cog in the machine of corruption that you built to protect your criminal empire. It's all in here, in Clara's own hand. You're bluffing, Chester hissed, but the command was gone from his voice. It was the desperate plea of a cornered animal. Am I? Charles turned to Clara. How many copies of this journal are there? 3, Clara said, falling perfectly into step with his gamble. Her voice was strong, confident. I made 2 exact copies over the years. One is hidden in the floorboards of the town church. Another is with the traveling preacher who makes his circuit through the outlying settlements every few months. She paused, letting the words hang in the air, then delivered the final blow with a small, triumphant smile. And the third one. I sent the third one to the territorial capital with a trusted friend over a week ago. Charles watched the last bit of color drain from Chester Draper's face. You see, Chester, you taught me a very valuable lesson today. You're absolutely right. The families deserve their money back, but they also deserve justice, real justice. If you expose this, you'll destroy yourself, Chester snarled, his composure shattering. You are standing in a bank, in possession of $44 million in stolen money. They'll hang you right alongside me. Maybe they will, Charles said calmly. But those families will get their money back. And the powerful men who helped you, the men who are supposed to uphold the law, they will finally face a reckoning. Sometimes, Chester, doing the right thing costs you everything. Chester's hand twitched, his fingers flexing near the handle of his pistol. But Charles was ready for it. I wouldn't, he said, his voice dropping low and hard. Because I imagine Miss Malloy's friend has very specific instructions. If anything unfortunate were to happen to either of us, I suspect those other copies of the journal would be delivered much more publicly. And then there will be no deals to be made. No negotiations. Just a rope. The bank fell into a dead silence. The only sound was Chester's ragged breathing. His 2 large henchmen were looking at each other, then at the exits, their loyalty visibly evaporating with every passing second. You have a choice, Chester. Charles pressed his advantage. You can help us. Help us return every last dollar to the families you ruined. You can turn yourself in, face the consequences, and maybe, just maybe, find an ounce of redemption. Or, you can try to fight this. And I guarantee you, every single person involved in your filthy network, starting with you, will swing from the gallows before winter. Chester Draper, the man who had built an empire of fear and greed, stared at Charles. His mind was clearly racing, searching for an escape route that no longer existed. Finally, in a voice that was nothing more than a defeated rasp, he spoke. What exactly are you proposing? It's simple, Charles said. We give the money back, all of it. We present the evidence of the widespread corruption to honest officials, men outside your sphere of influence. And you will provide a full testimony. You will help us tear down the entire corrupt system that allowed a man like you to flourish for so long. And in return? Chester asked, his voice weak. In return, Charles said, you get the chance to face justice as a man who tried, in the end, to do the right thing. Instead of a common thief who died alone, protecting a fortune he couldn't take with him. Chester looked around the dusty, abandoned bank one last time, at the crumbling remnants of his kingdom. When he finally, slowly, gave a single defeated nod, Charles knew his 15-cent purchase had bought him something he never could have imagined. It hadn't bought him wealth. It had bought him the chance to turn a legacy of darkness into a beacon of justice. 6 months later, Charles stood in that same bank, but the air was different. The silence was peaceful, not menacing. Down below, the secret room was empty. Every last crate of stolen money was gone, returned to the families who had lost it. The town of Millfield was slowly coming back to life. Mrs. Henderson had used her returned inheritance to buy back the laundry and was now running it as her own successful business. The Miller family had reclaimed their farm, and word was their first harvest in years was going to be a good one. The Williamson children, he'd heard, had new shoes and were attending the town school every single day. Clara came from behind the counter. She was holding a letter with the official territorial seal pressed into the wax. "The final report from the Capitol," she said, her voice quiet as she handed it to him. Charles broke the seal and read. Judge Morrison and Marshal Webb had been officially removed from office and were awaiting trial. Chester Draper's testimony, along with the evidence in the journals, had led to the conviction of a dozen other corrupt officials across the territory. He scanned down to the bottom of the page. In exchange for his full cooperation, Chester Draper's sentence had been reduced from death by hanging to 20 years of hard labor. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked, watching his face. "You could have kept some of it. A small fortune. No one would have ever known the difference." Charles folded the letter and tucked it into his coat pocket. "I would have known," he said simply. "And seeing those families every day, knowing I was living a life of luxury built on their continued poverty, that's a price I wasn't willing to pay." "Good," Clara said with a small smile, "because the territorial governor has an offer for you. He wants to appoint you as the new regional bank inspector." Charles couldn't help but laugh at the irony. His 15-cent gamble had transformed his life after all, just not in the way he'd expected. He hadn't found wealth. He'd found something far more valuable. He'd found out what kind of man he was when faced with an impossible choice. "And what about you?" Charles asked her. "Will you be staying on in Millfield?" "For now," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Someone has to help these families manage their finances properly this time. And besides," she added, her smile widening, "someone has to keep an eye on the new bank inspector, make sure all that power doesn't go to his head." He laughed again, a full, genuine sound that echoed through the empty building. "I think I can handle that kind of supervision." They walked to the front door together and stepped out into the afternoon sun. Charles looked down the dusty street. The people of Millfield didn't watch him with suspicion anymore. They nodded. They smiled. Children were actually playing in the street, their laughter filling the air. The whole town felt like it could finally breathe again. Not because a hidden treasure had been found, but because a long-buried truth had finally been brought into the light. Charles untied his horse from the hitching post, knowing that tomorrow would bring a whole new set of challenges. But he also knew that he would face them as a man who had learned the most expensive lesson of his life, that a man's integrity is the only currency that truly holds its value in the end. If you enjoyed this story of justice, redemption, and moral courage in the Wild West, click on the video appearing on your screen now to watch another incredible tale where ordinary people face extraordinary choices. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. Consider leaving a super chat to help support our mission of bringing you these compelling tales from America's frontier. Your support helps us research historical events, craft engaging narratives, and continue sharing stories that remind us of the power of doing what's right, even when it's difficult. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.